Welcome everybody to the fourth spring webinar in our Finger Lakes Forecast series. It's a beautiful day out there. Thank you for joining us. I'm Gay Nicholson. I'm the president of Sustainable Finger Lakes, and I'm so glad you could join us today as we learn about the basics of how our New York grid functions, the factors that are impacting um, both cost and reliability. Of our electric system. Anyway, this topic of the grid has never been more salient as electric bills continue to rise. Massive data centers are clamoring for access to our grid, and extreme weather and delayed maintenance of both generation and distribution systems ramps up our risk profile. Our organization has been working since 2004 on the many challenges we face as our planet heats up and we scramble to find ways to slow it down, while meanwhile coping with so many interwoven social and economic impacts that are already hitting home. Our Finger Lakes Forecast webinars are, trying to continue this work by offering a place where we can learn together about the many diverse ways climate change will interact with the forces that shape our lives, our environment, and our regional economy. Today's webinar is the last in our spring series, but we will let you know when we start back up again in the fall. With us today are two people with substantial knowledge about how the electric grid works in New York and the challenges to its reliable functioning and how residents can intervene in this system. Our first panelist is Kevin Lanahan, Senior Vice President for External Affairs and Corporate Communications with the New York Independent System Operator, or known as NYISO. Kevin has 25 years of experience in the energy industry and is very familiar with grid operations. NYISO operates New York's high voltage transmission system, manages the state's comprehensive wholesale electricity markets, and conducts comprehensive power system planning. Kevin is going to walk us through the basics of how the grid operates and the factors that are impacting both cost and reliability of our electric system. And then our next speaker will be Laurie Wheelock, the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Public Utility Law Project, or PULP as it's known. PULP is a nonprofit organization that has been advocating for universal service, affordability, and customer protections for New York State utility consumers since 1981. Their organization's mission is to educate the public about its legal rights as utility consumers, engage in research and advocacy, and provide legal representation for low-income utility consumers. PULP has been involved in many rate cases before the Public Service Commission, advocating to protect consumers from the rapidly escalating delivery rates that our investor-owned utilities have imposed. Now, we're going to save questions until the end, but feel free to use the Q&A button to submit your questions to the panelists, and we'll dig into those at the end. Okay, so let's get started, Kevin. Go ahead.
All right. Excellent. Apologies, our system doesn't work very well with Zoom, but glad we have it worked out. I'll dive right in. Greetings. Pleasure to be with you all today. So what you see there is a picture of the NYISO control room, which is located in Rensselaer, New York. That is the nerve center of the entire electric system in New York. What the control room operators on that floor are doing is, in simple terms, balancing consumer demand with the amount of supply available to them on the system. They're dispatching the megawatts and the electrons from hundreds of generators across the state, making decisions on where to place that energy on the transmission system in order to serve fluctuations in consumer demand second by second, hour by hour, every day of the year. We are an independent organization, heavily regulated, chiefly by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but also to a certain extent by the Public Service Commission, and beholden to several reliability organizations that work together to make sure that the rules under which we have to operate the system are adhered to. We're a not-for-profit, about 625 employees at the NYISO, And first and foremost, our major responsibility is to maintaining and enhancing, improving based on fluctuating issues on the system, reliability of the high voltage electric system. So that's what those control room operators and that you saw in that picture are responsible for, and thinking about as they look at all that data on in the control room on that screen that you see. The second major responsibility we have is detailed is to administering or overseeing the competitive wholesale electric markets. This is where the commodity is bought and sold. There is a reliability function to the markets. We are seeking the most efficient way to serve that reliability function. So two principles: reliability inside of the competitive markets, but at the most efficient cost. We're also making sure that we have a group of folks that pore over all the financial transactions that happen in the markets. And last year, $12 billion flowed through those markets. And that group is looking at all those financial transactions and making sure that the market participants in those markets are behaving according to the rules. If they aren't, we look for anomalies, odd transactions that might stand out. We have the ability to investigate or, if need be, discipline those market participants if they're taking positions that they should not be or that are not in accordance with the rules. The third major responsibility we have is for long-term planning of the high voltage system. So tying back to that first responsibility, how is the system changing? What is technology doing in terms of how the grid operates? What reliability issues do we see on a planning horizon of roughly 5 to 10 years that we need to address beginning now? And that's really where we're going to focus a lot of our attention in this particular discussion today. As I mentioned, the planning process looks roughly 5 to 10 years ahead. It's a capital intense industry. And so if we need to build major infrastructure, we want to be able to identify reliability needs well ahead of time in order to make those investments. And when we perform the reliability studies, we're seeing several themes pop up. The first is electrification of primarily the building and transportation sectors is really driving the increased demand that we're experiencing in real time these days. Certainly going to impact the long-term planning horizon, but the increased demand that we're seeing these days is really due to that electrification of the building and transportation sectors. When we think about large loads, whether it be data centers or large manufacturing facilities like the Micron facility in central New York, that is future demand that we're building into those studies. We're not really experiencing a lot of that currently. That's for the future, and we've got to get ready for that now if that demand is going to come onto the system. At the same time, we're not adding enough new generation to the system. We're gonna detail that later, but the incumbent fleet is really aging well beyond the average industry life of the machines that we're relying on more and more. We're losing supply and not adding enough new commensurate supply to make up for a decline in the energy reserves. And although it's having an impact on summer demand, certainly what we really are concerned about is future winter demand. It's an increasing risk, and it has certainly different health and safety implications going forward. So let's take a quick look at the current makeup of our generation fleet. This is a busy set of donut charts, but I'll just have you focus on the donut chart in the middle, which calculates the aggregated amount of resources and the production of those resources to meet consumer demand in 2025 in our upstate zones. And when I say upstate, for us, we at the NYISO, we think of upstate as roughly the capital district, north and west. The Hudson Valley, New York City, and Long Island, we consider to be downstate. And if you look at the production of megawatts in those upstate zones, clearly approaching 90% of it is zero emissions. And that's because that's where the bulk of the hydro is, the bulk of our nuclear facilities, all of our nuclear facilities now that we've retired Indian Point, and all of the wind production as well. The downstate zones, again, Hudson Valley South to the city and Long Island, is where the fossil fuel generation still exists. So if we're going to decarbonize our electric system, that's where the work is that we need to do pursuant to the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Together, on the left-hand donut chart, you can see that the production of facilities in New York amounts in 2025 to roughly half being emissions-free. If we lost any of those nuclear facilities, that number is going to go down dramatically. And if you look at this, what we call sand art chart of our fuel mix from 2025 on, you can see roughly around 2022 a bump up in the dual fuel, and that's oil and natural gas production, along with the gas, because that is when we retired Indian Point. So that's where you see the nuclear sand band in sort of green or gold begin to decline, and then the dual fuel and natural gas production pop up. So as soon as we retired Indian Point, we started to rely more and more on the incumbent fossil fuel fleet to meet peak demand. You can see at the top, however, some better news where solar has grown considerably, and that is mostly, almost entirely behind the meter solar, which and we're going to talk about later, has a real benefit to shaving peak demand. Over time, we have been able to reduce in our current fleet the amount of SOx and NOx emissions and CO2, and that is in large part because of the competition that the markets provide for efficiency and cleaner fuel. But again, you see that bump up in CO2 roughly around 2022, 2021. Again, retiring Indian Point and relying more and more on the incumbent fossil fuel fleet. When I spoke earlier of the aging fleet, this gives us some statistics into how old and what the makeup is. So about 10% of our total in-state energy production is coming from units that are 70 plus years or older. So just like an aging car, to drive from here to there, it's going to break down more. And we certainly have seen that in recent events going back to last June's heat wave and this past February's cold snap. But roughly speaking, we're relying more and more on units that are well beyond their industry life, 50 to 60 years or older. And again, as the equipment breaks down, it's more prone to break additional, as the equipment ages, more prone to additional breakdowns, and it's becoming more costly to repair those. And what we're concerned about is what we hear from the operators of those facilities. There may be cases where we cannot find replacement parts for those units that are 70 plus years or older. I talked about the increasing gap of new facilities connecting to make up for the retiring facilities. And this gives us some rough numbers into that gap. So we've added just shy of 3,000 megawatts of new supply, almost entirely renewable facilities, some battery storage, a lot of wind, a little bit of utility scale solar, and deactivated or retired, again, 2,000 megawatts of Indian Point nuclear production, but then also about 1,750 megawatts of dirty, old, inefficient peaking units, mostly in the city and on Long Island. But when we lose a megawatt of that dispatchable fossil fuel capacity, we really need to add about 3 megawatts of the intermittent renewable production to make up for it, because it is intermittent. So just keep that in mind. The gap is actually larger than the numbers would lead us to believe. Let's take a look at future planning and what's happening with demand on the system. And this will deal with some of the data centers and large load impacts. So all things being equal, when we perform our planning studies, we capture data from various different sources. the federal government, the Energy Information Administration, NYSERDA, the programs that they are running to gain efficiencies in the system. Where are the heat pumps being installed? Where are the electric vehicles charging? We're gaining data from places like Standard & Poor's and Moody's as well. We capture a lot of diverse data from places. And what we see is, all things being equal, our peak summer demand would go down over the time horizon. But we're adding electric vehicles, which is pursuant to the public policies. That's the good news. They are working. We're adding building electrification. So we have buildings in the city pursuant to local law 97 mandates that are changing out their fossil fuel heating and cooling systems. And then, of course, but that doesn't tell us the real story. We are also adding and expecting large load projects to impact summer demand going forward. And we're modeling in about 2,700 to 3,500 megawatts of large loads that have gone through our interconnection process and are likely to connect to the system. However, this chart demonstrates for us, if you look at the gold, what we are modeling in, or we call expected large load demand impacts, but we have over 10,000 megawatts of additional large loads that are in the queue, that are going through the process of being studied and analyzed and could connect. Will all of them? Unlikely. However, the potential is the gap between that gold and that green dotted line for additional large loads that we are not modeling into our forecast yet because they have not completed the process. So the specter of additional demand in summer is definitely going up. But as I mentioned earlier, our real worry is winter demand, being able to meet the winter peak. That is the paradigm. That is the challenge before us. And you can see here much more impact in the winter of electric vehicle additions, building electrification, and then those large load projects. We have approved 2,000 megawatts or 2 fabs of Micron large loads for central New York. And that is demand as they've represented to us that does not fluctuate, that they will not have opportunities for in terms of demand response. So now we're talking about interconnection, and to explain, we as the NYISO, as the grid operator, are responsible for reviewing and studying both large load projects that over 10 megawatts that want to connect to the system, but also new generation 50 megawatts or above, or uprates of existing generation. The good news is that since 2019, more than 14,000 megawatts of new generation, almost all of it entirely clean generation, has gone through this process, and they have an interconnection agreement from the New York ISO. The less good news here is that only about 4,500 megawatts of that 14,200 has actually broken ground since they've gained those approvals. Why? We don't always know, but certainly inflation, supply chain constraints, the ability to gain financing and keep financing has had a big impact on projects looking to break ground across New York. I will mention that 4,500 megawatt number of projects that has broken ground, pursued construction, includes 1,250 megawatts of the Champlain Power Express line out of Canada that injects hydropower directly into New York. So if you back that out, we have the picture on wind and utility scale solar is much less. Currently, so we talked about just then, projects that have already gone through our queue and have an interconnection agreement from the NYISO successfully. Bit better news, we're currently looking at about 15,500 megawatts of new intermittent renewable supply that would seemingly connect to the system almost at the end of this process. Still a few months to go, but this demonstrates continued interest. But again, if we take the trend on the previous slide of projects that once they gain that interconnection agreement, pursue construction, we're a little cautious about how much of that is actually going to connect. On the large load side, again, two parts of the queue: generation 50 megawatts and above that we have to review, and large loads 10,000 megawatts and above that we have to review. This demonstrates the amount of growth in those large load projects. As of March 2026, there were 12,520 megawatts in the large load side of the queue, totaling 50 projects or above. The clear majority of those is data centers, of course. I already mentioned that. In 2022, we had about 1,000 megawatts with 6 large load projects. So you can understand now the amount of growth on the large load side of the queue has really taken us by surprise. It's certainly had a slowing effect on our ability to review all of these. And the aggregate number of projects that are under review at the same time promises that there will be significant upgrades necessary to accommodate all of those on the high voltage system. A quick look at a couple of recent events I mentioned up top, and then we'll be through with my presentation, that demonstrate to us the current behavior, conditions on the system, and our increasing concern about being able to meet current increased demand. We had a heat wave last June. All things being equal, we don't typically see that kind of hot weather, persistent hot weather in June. It's usually reserved for July or August, but we saw it on June 22nd through the 24th of last year. So hotter than expected temperatures. Demand reached almost 32,000 megawatts. Our highest peak recorded demand is just shy of 34,000 megawatts in 2016. Certainly, renewable resources helped shave peak during that event. We'll get to that in a second, both wind and solar. But unless we had the renewables and unless we ran demand response programs through this event, we would very likely have broken our historic peak demand last June. So that to us is a bit of a scary statistic. The chart on the left shows through the event when the renewables provided certain production in the hours. So if you look at the gold mountains, that is when the behind the meter solar peaked. And the I'm sorry, that is the demand. And you can see when on the green line, when the utility scale wind came in. So on day one, the line sort of corresponds with the peak, but was only really producing for us about 1,000 megawatts. Certainly helped shave the peak, but then we saw overnight when it really gave us some measurable additional megawatts, about 1,600 megawatts. So certainly helped in terms of production, but didn't correspond with the peak on day one. Day two corresponded, but again, we were only getting about 1,200 megawatts, and then it dropped off on day three. So it helps us through the first 2 days of the event, but then drops off considerably. The chart on the right shows when the behind the meter solar comes in. Certainly helps through the peak hours to shave peak demand, and that means we're running fossil fuel plants and those dirty, inefficient peaker plants less. But something that happened through this June event that we haven't seen before is that as the sun set and the behind the meter solar came off, the load continued to increase beyond dark. Typically, darkness comes, temperature drops, the consumer starts to raise their thermostat, lower their demand. But the opposite happened. The behind the meter solar actually masked what the true demand was, and it continued to increase for us into the dark hours of up to 9 o'clock at night and beyond what we typically see. But we didn't have that behind the meter solar. So we called on peaker plants to meet that demand, and many of them were forced outages because of breakdowns. And that is speaking to the aging resource concerns that I mentioned earlier. And now a quick look at the January cold snap and the February cold snap of this year. The reliability paradigm and challenge in winter is very different than summer. In summer, we're looking for every possible megawatt that we can find in terms of what the aggregate number of generation units can produce, called resource adequacy. In winter, it's very different paradigms called transmission security, and we're trying to find, or the generating assets are trying to find fuel in order to produce megawatts. And because in this case, the eastern half of the country was under a cold snap from Florida all the way north, the demand for natural gas was at historic proportions. Florida was seeing in Miami temperatures of 30 degrees. And so that means everybody across the eastern half of the country was using natural gas for space heating, and the generating assets are second in line behind the retail consumer in terms of being allowed to tap into the natural gas infrastructure. And that means units would have had challenges of getting that natural gas to produce the megawatts, even though the consumer demand was rising. We have units in the city that have an ability to tap into on-site oil to burn in place of the natural gas. So we will work with them to balance their consumption of their on-site oil, and that helps free up the natural gas on the system to produce the megawatts that the consumer is demanding. But we got very close again, just like in the summer of 2025, in January 2026, of seeing our historic peak demand, but this time in winter. And we were seeing, as that fourth bullet down shows, between 1,200 megawatts and 3,000 megawatts of planned capacity being unavailable day in, day out through the event. One, because they couldn't get gas on the system. They couldn't find contracts. There wasn't enough of it because the retail consumer was using it for space heating, or they were having to pay, in some cases, record prices for that gas, or they were having breakdowns, again, because we were relying on aging resources. So we got very close to depleting some of our oil reserves. We got close with some units breaking down, and we definitely got close to some of our historic energy reserves for winter. Again, just like last summer, we ran demand response programs for each of the cold snap days, record amounts of demand response. If you're not familiar with what that is, that's large energy consumers on the system that we can call on and require them to reduce their real-time consumer demand. So think of high rises in New York City or large manufacturing facilities in upstate New York. We can call on them, ask them to reduce their usage in real time. We ran record amounts of that during the cold snap. And I think I am going to just, in the interest of time, move to this chart and give folks an idea of how much renewables we are adding to the system. So we did have a peak in terms of behind the meter solar generating production last week. So that's good news. You can see the additions that we have year in, year out. The light blue band is the amount of behind the meter solar that's being added. So behind the meter solar is on your rooftop or a small warehouse, for instance, in the city. It's not grid connected. We cannot control it from that control room. But the darker band on top of the lighter blue band is the utility scale solar that is on the system, grid connected, and we can control that. So not as big of growth in the utility scale, but definitely meaningful amounts of behind the meter solar that definitely helps, as we saw in that explanation of the June heat wave, shaving the peak and then leading to less fossil fuel generation in real time. Wind production has also been meaningful through year in, year out. And the light blue bands here are land-based or terrestrial wind. And you can see the additions in terms of offshore wind that are happening. Not as big growth, but definitely has been helpful as of late for us to be able to enjoy some of that offshore wind production. And I think I'm going to leave it there, Gay, in terms of this slideshow and leave room for Laurie to get through her presentation.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and stick around because there are a lot of questions in the Q&A that are coming in for you. So you might want to study that a little bit so we can address them as a group and have it be included in the recording. So now we're going to hear from Laurie Wheelock about pulp and their efforts to protect us on the consumer side of things.
Well, thank you so much, Gay and Emily and everyone at Sustainable Finger Lakes for inviting me. Thank you, Kevin. It's, great to be here with you. To all the viewers, thank you for tuning in during your lunchtime. And just wanted to give a special shout out to the Pulp staff on. I had a whole team help me get ready for today, and they include Jackson, Sonia, and Rachel at Pulp. And we're excited again to be here. Fear not, we have given all of our slides between Pulp and Kevin with the NYISO. Sustainable Finger Lakes has them. They will be emailed out after today's presentation. I have set an alarm for myself to make sure that we have time to go over Q&A. So when I get that timer, I will, speed up where I'm going. But essentially, what I'm going to talk about today is the pulp view, the Public Utility Law Project, who we are, how we interact in this utility world with the grid, and what is our kind of vision and how the state will move forward. We have a lot to cover, so deep breaths as we talk about here at Pulp. We love to make sure that people can sponge and then engage in the information. So just know we're going to have citations at the end and, some good conversation as well. So who are we? Well, again, we're the Public Utility Law Project. We go by PULP for short. Everything in this energy and utility space has an acronym, including us. But essentially, we are a small but mighty nonprofit. So we're not the utility. We're not government entity. We are a nonprofit that serves all of New York State. There are 16 of us, so that's where that small thing comes in. But we are mighty in the fact that we work together to help people across New York who are low-income residential customers. And we do everything through our direct service program, from helping to prevent shutoffs when people fall behind on their utility bills to helping individuals access financial assistance programs. We also do a lot of outreach and education. And again, while maybe our mission is very niche in helping residential low-income customers, our education and outreach does a lot to help all income brackets. So just kind of elevating that lens of who we are and what we do. In our world, we talk about the grid a lot through delivery rates. And so I want to do some level setting. Kevin spent a lot of time from the NYISO viewpoint on that generation, that supply side. I'm going to hit on that teeny little bit, but also really dive more into the delivery side and talk about the players. So in our world, when we're talking about your utility bill and what's coming to you and how you'll ultimately be charged and what that money will be used for, when we're working on the delivery side of the bill, there are ultimately two kind of entities that we communicate with heavily along with the utilities. And the first is the Public Service Commission, or PSC. Again, everything has an acronym. But the Public Service Commission plays a very important role when it comes to delivery rates and ultimately what the utilities are allowed to charge us as customers and then what they do with those funds. And the Public Service Commission is a 7-member body. They're appointed by the governor and confirmed by the New York State Senate. Those 7 members then are the ones voting. They're the ones that are approving the utility delivery rate plans and the different programs. They ultimately hold accountable the utilities for that safe and reliable and adequate service. Underneath that Public Service Commission is the Department of Public Service, or DPS. They are the staff. They're the ones actually out there in the delivery rate cases. They're the ones answering consumer questions and concerns when someone wants to file a complaint against the utility. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they're the enforcers. They're the ones looking at the consumer protections, the billing rules, and they're the ones that are acting on a daily basis. Together, though, the mission, the heart of that Public Service Commission is to try and ensure that New Yorkers are being provided safe and reliable utility service at just and reasonable rates. And that line is extremely important. That's the kind of scrutiny and the rule that comes to that delivery side of the bill. So pull up that NYISO bill, and again, you're going to see those two worlds. Everything that Kevin and I are talking about today between the different costs associated, the supply side of the bill, it is not regulated by New York State. It is, open market, very different than the delivery side, which again is where I'm going to focus. The delivery cost is ultimately what the utility charges to deliver that electric or gas to you. And so that can't be changed. NYISO can't wake up tomorrow and be like, you know what? We're going to change that delivery charge. They have to file a rate case, and it kicks off an administrative process where they actually have to file, and they often do, sometimes hundreds, thousands of pages of documents saying, this is what we want to increase on the delivery side, and this is what we want to do with the amount of money we're going to collect from ratepayers. And there's an administrative process. Entities can get involved. I see there are a number of parties actually on today's call who are in the rate case with Pulp. And so I'm not going to go through every one of them, but for instance, Tompkins County is, a party to the rate case, as is Pulp. The Department of Public Service is officially a party. And we get into the rate cases often for about a year and get to dig through the materials and really push the utility on what they're asking for. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So again, looking at NYSEG and the rate case that they filed about a year ago, when NYSEG filed, they did request one of the largest delivery rate increases in history. And they had to set forth a case and make arguments for why they were asking for that much. Now, there's a lot going on the gas side. I'm being very honest. I'm not going to really dig into that today. But that gas side was about a $93 million ask. And ultimately, a lot of good questions about what is the future of gas, leak-prone pipe, things of that nature, the state's environmental goals. I'm not really going to touch on that, but what I'm going to touch on for this presentation is that electric side and the infrastructure and what NYSEG is proposing to do. Now, again, they've asked for a very large amount of money. With the electric infrastructure alone, they were asking for $189 million. And from the start of that rate case, it was a bit different. Typically, what happens is parties get into settlement. We actually sit at a table, we talk about things, we negotiate in confidentiality with the various parties and the utilities. But because of the large rate increase, because of other things happening, such as a billing investigation, an active audit, there was 5 weeks of litigation where groups like Pulp got to actually cross-examine the company on what they wanted to do with this large increase. Ultimately, what they were asking for was about $33 more on the electric side and about $33 more on the gas side from utility customers. Now, again, the rate cases typically go on for about a year. And last month, something else kind of unique happened in this rate case. The Public Service Commission made the decision to set temporary rates, and I've listed them here. Small increases really directed again at this capital question, at the projects that go into the company's infrastructure. And so it was interesting. Ultimately, what we heard was an urge to go back into settlement and try to do some sort of agreement that would ultimately result in a multi-year rate plan. So this case, at the end of the day, what I think is most important for the public to know, it has been different. And it's been going on now for over a year, and it's still very, very active. So moving forward, really talking about what's going on. Why, again, is this case kind of unique? And especially on that grid side, you have to take kind of a step back and look at the company and some of those historical struggles. The delivery side, again, is that infrastructure. It's the lines, it's the poles, it's all of those costs that go into delivering that electricity to you as customers. And it's important to know that NYSEG has struggled on that reliability side of their service. In the last 5 years, they've failed to hit kind of targets in performance when it comes to interruption frequency. And so that is something that, again, the state is monitoring. How often are they losing, service? How long are those outages happening? How often are they happening? Those are all really important questions. When you look at what the company has, it is honestly a lot of old wires, a lot of steel, a lot of old poles. And so there's this interesting history there that we have to look at. 79% of NYSEG service interruptions in 2024 were caused by downed trees, equipment failures, outages to try and again make repairs. So there's a whole history here. And then later, we're going to get into the AI data center question, the large load. It's important to know that their service territory is in zones A and C, where there's, to what Kevin had pointed out earlier, a lot of requests right now to kind of connect to the grid. So, nutshell here, we are coming into this rate case with a whole history here and a lot of questions about how that grid is operating in that NYSEG service territory. In the rate case, where Pulp and others get to dive in, is we're going, okay, there's all this history, there's all these issues. What is the company doing with that ratepayer money now to fix this, but also what are they asking for? What do they want to do with the additional money they're seeking? And so I'm not going to go through each of these projects, but we thought it was really important to pull out some of the proposals. This is all public information. You can get it on the state's website at the Department of Public Service, but these are some very specific projects the company identified in the Finger Lakes area, as well as how much projected cost potentially to do this work. And a lot of these are enhancing substations, replacing circuit breakers, things of that nature. And the rate case gives us that ability to dive in and go, okay, NYSEG, this is everything you want, but what have you done with the ratepayer money to date? What projects are your priority? Where are you focusing? Are you being responsible with what you have? And so it's a very interesting sort of ability to get in there, have that transparency, and have some of these conversations. Now, Pulp, again, our kind of work really falls in this delivery side of the utility bill and what the companies are charging to have that electricity and gas delivered to you. This slide has a lot of information on it, but what I want to flag here is that we are actively trying to help elevate the transparency on what these delivery plans look like. And so for today's presentation, I'm just going to have us focus on this bottom left graph, which shows in 2015, 2019, 2022, and 2025. These are the prior rate cases and the rate plans. Again, most rate cases, the company files, and then they spread the costs out over a number of years, usually about 3 years. But what the public often doesn't realize is that means the delivery rates get increased every year, let's say in May. And so we are trying to actively track this. We're going to be putting this on Pulp's website so that folks can see, okay, every May, my delivery rate is going to go up. It's going to go up by this much. And it helps, again, the public try to track what's going on with that delivery side and ultimately how much more the utility companies are collecting. So lots and lots of activity. And again, the NYSEG rate case is still very active. It's been a unique one. But at the same time, we're going through that. The legislature in the state has been looking in general about these capital costs because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of discussion. What is happening? And so the capital costs in particular have been something of interest to the state legislature and the governor. So last year, again, recognizing that these projects can be very expensive, it can also be very difficult for the public to track. And so in 2025, a bill became law that essentially says when the utilities have to file their rate cases, they have to be more explicit and they have to pull out in a more accessible format information for the public. What is the purpose of these projects? What are the total costs? And what is the expected ratepayer benefit? For anyone who's looked at the rate filings in a rate case, it can be very hard to pull out some of this information and get this and then do those comparisons and track projects over multiple years. And so again, there's this interest in really kind of standardizing and pushing the utilities to bring more information out for the public to see at the very beginning of these rate cases. Then, interesting enough, we had a very long budget here in New York State, and I won't go into all the twists and turns there. But again, when that budget was finalized, we saw language further pushing the utilities on their capital expenses. Again, this is one of those major rate drivers. And so trying to push these companies not only to be more clear upfront what they're doing, but also pushing them on things such as, are you considering avoided energy? What potentially are the energy efficiency measures you're looking into? Were there alternatives, non-pipe alternatives, things of that nature, like really, again, pushing this conversation, seeing the capital projects and what, expensive kind of proposals are being brought forward. Another really interesting aspect, and for anyone who might be legal minded or in the legal field, almost like a strict scrutiny. Now, when the rate case is done, so once the NYSEG rate case is done, that case will have to go before the Public Service Commission. And so, interesting enough, the budget has put a very strong focus on the Public Service Commission, which again is that 7-member body who's going to vote on this rate plan. They have to look at every single capital project and they have to see if the company has proved whether or not it's just and reasonable and in the public interest. And so again, it's really pushing this review and this discussion to see ultimately what is needed versus maybe what is wanted. Where are the priorities? Where do we need to be focusing? Trying to put more checks and balances in this process and specifically on those capital projects. So one thing to flag, the budget language doesn't go into effect until 2027 and rate cases that will be filed after that time period. But again, it's this interesting kind of insight in how the state is looking at these rate cases and trying to push for more checks and balances and hopefully better planning, more affordability, better reliability outcomes in the end. So while the rate cases are very deep into each utility company, what potentially, they're proposing to do with those delivery costs, there are also so many things happening when it comes to grid planning in New York State. And so again, major thanks to Team Pulp. We tried to go through and pull out some of the most active right now, but there's a lot happening. So these are just 5 generic proceedings. Those are proceedings that anyone, who's interested, you can get involved. The Department of Public Service has a number of these happening right now, and each of them has kind of a different focus. The Grid of the Future proceeding started in 2024. Its kind of main theme is about modernizing infrastructure, looking how to deploy flexible resources, distributed energy resources, solar panels like that rooftop to at-home battery storage and even vehicle to grid kind of export back to the grid. So kind of the future innovation, that's kind of the theme of that one. Then there's even a coordinated grid planning process too, which ultimately is really about trying to get the utilities to work on a unified, proactive framework for planning across, transmission and distribution in New York. Then you have proactive planning for electrification. How are we bringing EVs on? How are we bringing heat pumps on? Large scale renewables. How are we bringing more of the renewables on the grid? What is happening with offshore wind? I mean, that keeps changing with the federal government, on a almost constant basis these days. But that is ultimately a place where some of that conversation is happening. And then the last one is about our compliance with, the CLCPA, and are the utilities tracking emissions reductions, things of that nature. Now, I'll be very honest, from Pulp's point of view, it can be extremely tricky to figure out where, with all these different proceedings, we go to have certain conversations. Sometimes we might be in a rate case, we may get told to go here. So just kind of flagging, the good news is there are a lot of proceedings happening, so there's conversations happening. But for the public, sometimes it can be tricky to figure out where you go to continue to have these conversations. So for the public, we have, again, the slide decks will be out. We'll have links to everything. But the important thing with this slide is to know conversations have been initiated, and it is an avenue to have a conversation with the utilities and with the state as well. Now, while Pulp, again, works with individual customers on a daily basis, I think what's really interesting, and being very honest, we get questions on a regular basis from individuals who are worried about their bills being high. They want to know why. Is it my usage? Is it the rates going up? And honestly, a lot of folks come to us and they are very worried about the AI data centers and what that means for their bills. Many people ask us now, they're like, is my bill up because of these AI data centers? And so our kind of footprint in this, our work here, and seeing my 20 minutes is already up, I'm going to go quickly through this part. Our piece here is to elevate and try to bring information from the concerns we're hearing, but also the lessons learned in other states. The data centers, the AI ones in particular, they run a data model. They're going to have high rack density, potentially out of nowhere, really drawing very large amounts of energy on the grid at any particular time. There's also questions about that heat output, how much water they need for the cooling system. And again, the grid planning and siting, where do they want to go? One of the things we are very worried about in the NYSEG rate case is how many of these are looking again at the service territory of the NYSEG RG&E area. And that makes us worry. There are a number of water concerns, and my team has done a really great job on this. I know Pulp is very known about energy, and we're here to talk about the grid, but there are significant questions about how these data centers will affect water draw, potentially hydropower in New York State, which about 21% of our electricity comes from. And then what are we going to do to those wastewater treatment facilities as well? Lastly, an amazing graph. Top one is a sample of what that hydropower and what that municipality looks like now. But where in the second one underneath we place those data centers could potentially affect the inputs, the draws, how much we are producing hydropower, as well as the wells. If we have wells drawn, where potentially will that affect the water table for us? Very high level other environmental concerns, PFAS use at these facilities in other states, medical, noise, light pollution. Seems to be a lot going on. And so for the public to be aware, the state is moving forward, having some of these conversations. There is a generic proceeding that Pulp is involved with where they're actively collecting comments on what's happening with these AI data centers. So no, top right corner, yellow graph here, blue language. You can file a comment today on any concerns, pros, cons with these AI data centers coming into the state. The legislature also on the last days of session in early June did pass a 1-year moratorium on the issuing of permits for new AI data centers. The belief being giving a pause to give time for the Public Service Commission and the Department of Environmental Conservation to evaluate and potentially come up with studies and regulations. So flagging, that has also happened, and it's going to sit there until the governor acts on it, until she has to act on it by the end of the year. So flagging, that is also part of the statewide conversation right now. Last slide, Gay. I'm going to be really quick about this.
Okay, don't worry.
Yeah. We know ultimately it's summer is coming. We never know. Hot day, storms. We want the public to be prepared. And some people have no idea that there are account codings you can seek to get from NYSEG or any of the major electric and gas utilities. Pulp staff work daily to get these protections because, goodness forbid, there's an outage or something that happens. You want NYSEG to know who in your household or you on your street have a medical need that will be aggravated if you lose your electricity. Older adults, blind, disabled, you can get coding on your account. And if you have someone with life-sustaining equipment, that is also another account coding. So just wanted to flag, people have rights to these. There's steps in here, information how to get them. Extremely important that the public be aware. So again, if there's ever an outage, we want that utility company to know someone has this coding and needs to have, that attention. So with that said, I am done with my part of the presentation and I'll turn it back over to you, Gay.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That was, and Kevin, what a rich set of information you've given to everybody who's attended today, and which has been a good-sized audience that's actively involved. We have 43 unanswered questions out of the 49 sitting there. And by the way, in the past, when we've had a really interested audience, a lot of questions, we go past our 1:15 departure. If you need to leave, do so. But this will be recorded. So all of the Q&A session, if we go over 1:15, it'll be recorded for people to check in later. And we can see about any unanswered questions if we can answer them and send that out as well afterwards. So Kevin, have you had a chance to peruse some of the ones that were aimed at you in terms of what questions would you like to start with?
Yeah, fairly sophisticated questions, sophisticated audience. So thanks. So I think maybe we can address a few of the questions by detailing what our role is with the interconnection process and data centers. So there's two different sets of rules for the two different sets of interconnection queue portfolios. I talked about generation. In that case, there are very specific deadlines, rules, requirements, and sets of collateral along the way for the generating assets that are applying for an interconnection agreement. And we, as a NYISO, have responsibility for issuing at the end that interconnection agreement with the utility. Very different on the load side. It's just the way the rules have been set up. And I know there's a question about how we're regulated. I'll get to that in a second. But the process that I'm describing for for interconnection is in federal tariff that's overseen by our regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So we are in the process of looking at, with the market participants and the regulator, how to change the rules for the load side of the queue, but they're not as prescriptive as the generation side. And we do not issue the interconnection agreement. The utility does that. What we do is we perform an engineering study. We gather the design specs from the developer. Here's how much in terms of what they expect to be using. Here's generally how they expect to run their facility. Here's the node or the specific part of the copper and wire on the system that they want to connect. And then we look at the impact they'll have on the system, but also what are the other large loads or generating facilities around it, and run some modeling. Once we perform that engineering study, we first decide what the scope of the study is with the developer and the utility. Then we run the engineering study. Then we take that study and we deliver it over to the utility and the developer, and they perform the interconnection agreement from there. And part of that is deciding how much it's going to cost and how much new equipment is going to be necessary in order to connect that facility reliably. We've prescribed it to a large extent. Now the utility and the developer need to go forth and perform the rest of the study, if you will. So it's non-binding as opposed to the generation side, which is binding. Lastly, a word about our oversight or regulations. So we do not make up rules like the interconnection process on what our responsibilities are. Those are memorialized in federal tariff overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. To change those rules or add to them, there's a whole governance process that includes input from all of the market participants and all of our stakeholders, which include many entities at the state level: Public Service Commission, LIPA, NYIPA, the Utility Intervention Unit. Public Utility Law Project has the ability to participate in our process as well, for instance. And so sort of a democratic legislative type process, if you will, to change the rules under which we operate, both the delivery of megawatts, the markets themselves where the price is determined, and then also the planning process. And the State Public Service Commission, somebody had a question about their involvement. They have to approve all our budget and any spending that happens. They also have the responsibility of looking at all the financial transactions that happen in the markets, just like we do. So there's a bit of check and balance there. I'll just say I didn't address the price on the supply side, or that the price issues that are happening in the markets. We are as concerned as anybody with the price spikes that we've seen, the increase on the supply charge. Our responsibility or remit is to operate the system and the markets as efficiently as possible. And that has become a real concern as of late with the rising prices. There's various different reasons for the increase in the supply charge, everything from the rising cost of natural gas to the inflationary pressures on getting equipment to build out the system. But we are as concerned as anybody when we see those kinds of prices in the markets.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Emily, do you want to curate from here in terms of, and are there some questions for Laurie? I haven't been able to keep up with all the questions.
Yeah, the first question I saw for Laurie was regarding a recent proposal by the activist groups seeking to reduce pricing for the distribution rates for their bill of heat pump homes, I believe. Yeah, do you see that question, Laurie?
I do not. And again, I think just being very honest, there are a lot of questions, but I am happy to answer that, Emily. And I'm also happy to follow up. I saw a number on the AI data centers, so maybe I can do that real
Yes.
quick. Okay. With our powers combined, we'll get through it all. So some of the activist stakeholders we work with on a regular basis, Environmental Defense Fund, Alliance for Green Energy Economy, Earth Justice, they filed a petition in the Grid of the Future proceeding, I believe it's that one, to actually have this discussion about having, electric heat pump rates for all service territories and what potentially that could look like with, electric heat in general. Pulp did sign on in support of the letter on that petition that was filed. I think we're very interested in having that conversation. We've seen in the rate cases individual, kind of like when we're in there in the rate case, often this comes up, but it makes sense with everything happening. And again, moving towards these goals, trying to get the installation of, electric heat. It makes sense, right, to have this conversation right now while we're doing everything else. And I think the Switchbox study that was cited in their petition is really strong at showing, kind of the overburden a lot of customers are paying right now. So Pulp is fully supportive of diving in and having that conversation. And again, I think for just being very honest, knowing where to have that conversation is extremely important. For our group, we don't want to be punted from one thing to the next or not be able to have a conversation here. We would love it just to be like, this is where we're going to have this conversation. We would love to have a plan by, X amount of time. So I think that's ultimately where we'd love to go. And timing is important. I think timing, switching now to the AI data center discussion, is a big question. We see a lot of municipalities across the state doing their own resolutions right now to put those moratoriums in place. Being, again, very honest, the bill that passed was for 1 year. And so we see municipalities doing 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. There's a big question about that and how much time we as a state may need to just take what we're seeing, compare it with what we have already in New York in the process, and then what else might we need to do to have, this influx come in. So lots happening in that realm, and we're excited to be part of the process. Saw questions in the chat about, do we think the governor will sign it? What can people do right now? You know, Never know, but we do again have open public comment in that Public Service Commission docket on the large load. I have a slide, like it's active, you can click it. We recommend people share stories, talk about it. We know that there are, right, some applications out there, what's happening on the ground. Those stories are really important. And so we will absolutely make sure that that link is shared so that people can participate and elevate with others as well.
Thank you so much, Laurie.
Yeah,
We
if
still,
you don't mind, I'm
yeah,
going to jump in really
jump
quickly
in.
on this is a short answer to, I think, an important couple questions. I saw folks asking about grid enhancing technologies, and then I saw somebody ask about virtual power plants. And from a high level, we as the NYISO are very interested in anything that is going to bring measurable efficiencies on the system and additional megawatts to meet that rising demand for supply. So yes, grid enhancing technologies is something that our planning engineers and our market design folks are working on, and to some extent have implemented. Virtual power plants, same thing. Our control room operators are looking for that 10 megawatt battery technology to reach a critical mass, to be quite honest. From there, they can stack, as somebody's asking about virtual power plants, those 10 megawatt battery installations on top of one another, create a 200 megawatt, 150 megawatt virtual power plant. Very interested in that. Working on all of those proposals. We have to remember that whatever we price out in the markets, what we're talking about here, folks, virtual power plants or grid enhancing technologies, or what we refer to as components inside of our ancillary markets that the consumer pays for. So we want to calculate what those reliability benefits are accurately, so that we're also not, as Laurie will appreciate, burdening the customer with additional costs that they may not see a redeeming value on. So getting those technologies and the software built to implement those approaches, and then pricing them fairly according to the reliability benefits that they have. This is absolutely something that we are working very hard on.
Speaking as someone who's been very involved in pushing back against data center development, been very active in the recent bill that was passed finally. Um, the moral issue around people's electric bills becoming unsustainable, untenable, increases with millions of people that are in 2 months arrears on paying their electric bills, and tens of thousands last year cut off because they couldn't pay their electric bills. So this push for data centers, and even Micron, which has already used a lot of our tax dollars and subsidies, federal tax dollars. So it's like we've invested in Micron, like it or not. And what is the plan to add 1.3 gigawatts of capacity to the grid to feed Micron in the coming years? And these grid enhancement tech that you were just talking about, these are great ideas, but are we going to have to pay more for them so that we can have data centers? Wouldn't it be better to do the grid enhancements and efficiencies so that our bills go down, rather than, having to subsidize efficiency in order to add data centers that a lot of us are feeling like it's a lot of AI slop, and maybe the replacement of humans and jobs. So the moral aspect of this is top of mind for, I think, for a lot of people. Into my rant. Emily or Kevin, do you see other questions that we have time to address?
Yeah, I'll just jump in really quickly on the heels of that that information that you just put forward. So somebody asks here relatedly, one of the factors that may affect the current number of requests for new electricity might be the anticipation of denials. So we're running the modeling for these data centers, Gay, as you're highlighting, and we are starting to see, I think I mentioned earlier, thermal overloads, transfer capability issues with when we run the modeling. And when I say run the modeling, we have pretty sophisticated software, so we'll put virtually, we'll put these projects into a grid model, and it'll show where, when we connect all of these new facilities, Micron also generating units, where the upgrades are necessary to accommodate all of this in terms of running the system efficiently, reliably, and safely. And when we do that with these new projects, we see the system lighting up with all sorts of issues, all sorts of requirements. And so, to your point, Gay, we have connected data centers in the past, not very many of them. There was one last year that I think connected, but the bulk of them are still pending. And we may run into the reliability issues and supply issues with a great many of these facilities.
Yeah, good call to political action, everybody. That's in this webinar. Laurie, what would you like to say?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm seeing questions in the chat about high utility bills and what potentially to do. So I'm happy to address that real quick. And then I do apologize, I have to drop around 1:15. But again, all slides will be shared, citations and the like. What we recommend, and this is old school, but either if you get your NYSEG bill electronically, get a folder on your computer, save every single bill. If you get it in the mail, save that bill and do a cross compare. Watch your usage. Now, again, there's really three components that go into the number that appears on your NYSEG bill when you get it every month. There's how much you're being charged on the delivery side, again, regulated. What's going on with the supply market? Again, are prices up? Are they down? What's going on? And then how much you're using. And so that kind of information, you can do cross compares. Look at last December. Was it colder? Was it hotter? Did you have any equipment changes in your home? That's all the stuff that Pulp does once we start doing bill compares with individuals. Even reading, I'll be very honest, one NYSEG bill typically takes me about 45 minutes when I sit down and go through with someone. I go line by line, I check everything on that first bill, and then I start doing cross compares. And so just kind of being very honest, that's the deep dive we typically do in trying to figure out what might be going on. Again, as we flagged, typically on that delivery side too, they're getting multi-year rate increases. So every May, it may go up slightly. And so we have had that kind of perfect storm. We had a real winter. Kevin talked a little bit about what we saw last winter, the June heat wave. There's certain times of year where supply may be up, you may have the new delivery rates, and then that usage is up. But then every once in a while we see an issue. Maybe there was an issue with a meter. Maybe you're in a rate class that you weren't aware of or you didn't realize. There's all sorts of potential things we look for and try to help the public when we're doing those bill reviews. So just kind of flagging at the end of the day, go with your gut. If you have any questions, write them down, go to that utility company, have a discussion with them. You do have rights, and having that conversation is a good first step with the information you've collected over the years.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I know you need to leave and maybe we should wrap up, but Emily, can you capture all of these questions and maybe we can share them around and see if we can answer a few more of them that we didn't cover today. Emily, could you put up the final slide? We can speak to maybe a little bit of next steps. There we go. I just wanted to do a little bit of a call to action. As I had mentioned, we've been very involved in the local resistance to the proposed TeraWulf AI hyperscale data center on the shores of Cayuga Lake here. And We are hosting an event next Thursday night. The coalition that is working on this at the Unitarian Church at 7 p.m. in Ithaca. We'll be hearing from a number of speakers, so you can come and learn lots more about data centers and our pushback. And we were also we're very engaged in, all right, now that we did the amazing and got this law passed in only 5 months of citizen action around the data center moratorium and other bills that got turned into the omnibus bill. Now our objective is getting Governor Hochul to sign it without very many amendments, unless they're good amendments, from the point of view of us citizens. So here is a set-up phone number by Food and Water Watch that you can call to deliver a message to the governor urging her to sign the bill. There's also a virtual event hosted by Food and Water Watch next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. And they'll be going through, we've got sort of like an 8-point plan for getting the governor to sign the bill. So the more people that are involved in that, the better. I think there is also a petition circulating for her to sign, and soon we'll be back out. If you're with an organization, maybe email me and let me know if your organization would be interested in signing a letter to the governor to sign the bill. So there's work ahead for all of us on this. I just want to thank again our panelists that joined us today, and to all of you. What a great audience, so engaged and numerous for this Finger Lakes Forecast webinar. Again, I want to encourage you all to stay engaged on the topic and help guide decision makers for the greatest overall benefit to our communities. Next fall, I plan to bring you part 2 on this topic of the grid, of future-proofing the grid. The look to how to make sure these solutions to our current issues are designed to protect residential customers and our environment, especially when it comes to where does our low emission clean energy electrons get used. I'd rather have it come to the residential rates customers rather than industrial and data centers. If you'd like to support Sustainable Finger Lakes and programs like our Finger Lakes Forecast webinars, please visit our website's donation page at sustainablefingerlakes.org. And I really hope that you're going to join us next fall when we resume these webinars. Keep an eye out for an email from us with more information about that, towards the end of the summer. And I just want to thank all of our panelists again, and thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today and being such a great audience for this webinar. And I think that's a wrap. Again, thanks, Laurie. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Emily. Emily is our communications coordinator and is great help on running these webinars. So we'll end it there, and we will try to capture these questions, and we'll be sending you out a recording, a link to the recording, to the PowerPoint slides, and to other resources for you to read and have available to dig a little deeper into this topic area, because clearly it's complex and it's going to need a lot of citizen feedback to get what we need to protect ourselves. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Bye-bye.